Hello students, so today I am going to discuss about the topic which is using the group by clause with the grouping functions and using MySQL expressions without a table. Now let's start with the group by clause. The group by clause can be used along with the grouping functions. These were the list of grouping functions that I have already discussed in my previous Google Meet video. You can also name these grouping functions as aggregate functions. The list includes sum, count, max, mean, and average. So all those grouping functions can be used in conjunction with this group by clause. Now consider this table identified by the name purchase. This table includes 4 different columns: SID, DNAME, QTY, and PUR date. Okay. Now is the first column SID a primary key? No, it is not. This is because it contains duplicate entries of S40, and that's the reason this is not a primary key. Remember, for a column to be eligible to become a primary key, all its entries must be unique. There must not be any duplicate entries. So this column, since it is not a primary key, so this is not going to uniquely identify every record in this table. Now let's try to understand the group by clause with the help of this table named purchase. Look at this question. It says write a query in MySQL to display the total quantity of devices. Now the total quantity of devices can be determined with the help of this QTY column, where QTY stands for quantity. Now we need to find the total quantity of devices purchased by each student. Now the column that represents the student is SID. Now if I have to find the total quantity of devices purchased by each student, then for the student with SID as entry S10 can have the total quantity of devices as 5. Then for the student with SID entry as S20, the total quantity of devices purchased will be 2. For the student with SID entry as S30, the total quantity of devices purchased will be 3. Now look at the student with SID entry as S40. He has purchased the device named CD-ROM twice, first on this date, that is 5/9/2013, and secondly on this date, which is 26/1/2013. On 26 January 2013, he has purchased 10 quantities of the device CD-ROM, and on 5 September 2013, he has purchased only 1 quantity of that CD-ROM. So the total quantity of devices purchased by the student bearing the SID entry S40 shall be 10 plus 1, which is 11. So what are we actually doing here? We are trying to display the total quantity of devices purchased by each student. That means in order to display the total quantity of devices purchased by each student, we are first grouping the students so that the total quantity of device purchased shall be calculated separately for each student. So the query for this question shall be select SID, sum of QTY, where SID represents the student ID and sum of QTY represents the grouping function sum that shall add up the quantity of devices purchased for each student. But for that I have to make use of this group by clause. Since I am grouping each of the students by their SID column, that's why I am going to put the SID column after the group by clause. So this group by clause is going to group each of the students on the basis of their SID. And once the grouping has been done, I shall select the entries of the column SID that represents the student ID and the grouping function sum of QTY to calculate the total quantity of devices purchased for each student ID. Now I shall be selecting these two columns from the table purchase, which is this table. Now after selecting SID and sum of QTY, these two column entries show up in the output table like this. Now the SID with the entry S10 is occurring only once. So the total quantity of devices purchased will be 5 for S10. This shows S10 for SID and 5 for sum of QTY. Again, the SID with entry S20 is also occurring once, and the total quantity of devices purchased is 2. So S20 and 2 shows up as the second entry in the output table. Again, the entries S30 and S40 is also shown up in this output table. But the entry of the student with SID as S30 is occurring only once, and the total quantity of devices purchased is 3. So for that student with SID entry as S30, we can see S30 and 3 as the third entry in the output table. Then look for the student with the SID entry as S40. This is occurring twice. For the first entry of S40, the quantity of devices purchased is 1, and for the second entry of S40, the quantity of devices purchased is 10. Okay, so the total quantity of devices purchased for the student with the SID entry as S40 will be 10 plus 1, 11. So this is going to be summed up for the student with the entry S40. That shows S40 and 11 as the fourth entry in the output table. Now other than these SID entries, that is S10, S20, S30 and S40, there are no more SID entries in the table purchase. So as of now, on executing this query, I am going to see this particular output. So I first select SID and sum of QTY column and display it in the output table in the form of columns, and then perform the grouping on the basis of the column SID. So for each entry of SID in the table purchase, the total quantity has been calculated individually for each of the student IDs. Only the student with ID as S40 purchases the device CD-ROM on 2 different dates. In one of these dates, he has purchased the quantity CD-ROM only 1 number, and on the other date he has purchased the quantity CD-ROM 10 numbers. So both these will be added up, 10 plus 1, which shows 11 as the total quantity of devices purchased for the student bearing the ID as S40. You can also use the having clause in conjunction with the group by clause. The result set returned by the group by clause can be filtered using the having clause. That means once you execute a query that includes the group by clause, you will get a result set. That result set is nothing but the output. You can further filter that output or that result set using a having clause to get the final output or the result set. Now we shall be considering this table purchase again. Again here SID is not a primary key column because the entry S40 is getting repeated. Now look at this question. It says write a query in MySQL to display the total number of times that a student had purchased a device from the store. So if we have to find the total number of times that a particular student had purchased the device, we have to make use of the count aggregate function or the count grouping function. Now if you look at this table, how many times the student bearing the SID as S10 has purchased this device pen drive? The answer will be 1, because this student bearing the SID value as S10 has purchased 5 quantities of this device pen drive only once, that is on this particular date. Again, the student bearing the SID value as S20 has also purchased the device pen drive, and he has purchased 2 quantities of this device pen drive, but only once, that is on this particular date. Similarly, the student bearing the SID value as S30 has purchased the device RAM, and he has purchased 3 quantities of this device RAM only once, that is on this particular date. But if you see here, the student bearing the SID value as S40 has first purchased 1 quantity of the device CD-ROM on this particular date, and then he has again purchased 10 quantities of the device CD-ROM on this particular date. That means the student bearing the SID value as S40 has purchased the device CD-ROM twice, firstly on this particular date and secondly on this particular date. So if we group by this SID column, the count of this device name for which the device name is CD-ROM is going to show 2 for the SID as entry S40. But the count of the device name column, that is this dname column, is going to show 1 each for each of these student IDs, that is S10, S20 and S30. So if I execute the first part of the query, which says select SID, count of dname from the table purchase, and then if I group by the column SID, so the first part of the query is going to give this output. Selecting SID and count of dname is going to show SID and count of dname as the columns in this output table. And then if I group by SID, then the student with SID entry S10 purchases the device pen drive only once on this particular date. That's why for the student with SID entry as S10, count of dname shows 1. Again, the student with SID entry as S20 also purchases the device pen drive, but only on this particular date. That's why the SID entry in the output table for which the SID value is S20 shows 1 under the count of dname column. Then again, the student with SID entry as S30 has purchased the device RAM only on this particular date. So again, for this student with SID entry as S30, it shows the count of dname as 1 in the output table. Then lastly, the student with SID entry as S40 has purchased the device CD-ROM twice, first on this particular date and again second on this particular date. That's why the result set in the output table shows count of dname as 2 for the student bearing the SID entry as S40. But this is the result set or the output only if I execute the first part of the query. The second part of the query uses the having clause, which sets the condition that count of dname should be greater than 1. Now in this result set or this output, which record shows the count of dname greater than 1? If you look out here, only this particular record shows the count of dname value as greater than 1, because 2 here is greater than 1. and its corresponding student ID is S40. So this is the only student who has purchased the device twice, and the device name is CD-ROM. First time purchased on this date and second time purchased on this date. So now the output is going to be filtered. So instead of this output, you are going to see only this output, because only the student with SID as S40 has purchased the device twice, and that is indicated by the column count of dname value 2. Now you can also use the order by clause in conjunction with the group by clause. Now in this case, once you execute a query with the help of this group by clause, you are going to get a result set or an output. After that, you can arrange that result set or the output in a particular order. It can be in ascending order as well as in descending order using this order by clause. Remember, ascending order arranges from small to big and descending order arranges from big to small. Now look at the first part of the question. The question is asking us to display the minimum quantity of device purchased by each student. So look at this table purchase. Okay. What is the minimum quantity of devices purchased by the student with the SID entry as S10? Now this entry S10 is occurring only once, and for this the quantity of devices purchased is 5. So the minimum quantity of devices purchased will also be 5, because this particular student with ID as S10 has purchased this device pen drive in 5 numbers only in this particular date. He hasn't purchased it on a different date. So 5 quantities of pen drive that he has purchased on this particular date will also be the minimum quantity of device that he has purchased. So SID and mean of QTY is going to show 1 and 5 in the output column. Again, if you look at this table, the student with the SID entry as S20 has also purchased the device pen drive, and he has purchased 2 numbers of pen drive only on this particular date. So the minimum quantity of devices purchased will also show 2 for the student bearing the SID as S20. That's why the second entry in the output table shows S20 and 2. Sorry, there was an error in the first entry. The student ID for the first entry is not going to be 1, it will be S10, which is shown in the table purchase. Now let me correct it. Then again, if you look at this table, the student with the SID entry as S30 has purchased the device RAM and 3 numbers of that device only on this particular date. So the minimum quantity of devices purchased by this particular student, that is S30, will also be 3. And this shows S33 as the third entry in the output table. Now look at this entry of S40. This tells the student bearing the SID value as S40 has purchased the device CD-ROM twice. First in this particular date, where he has purchased CD-ROM in 1 number, and secondly on this particular date where he has purchased the device CD-ROM in 10 numbers. So he has purchased the device CD-ROM twice in 2 different dates. This shows S40 as the student ID or the SID entry in the output table. Next, what is the minimum quantity of device purchased by the student having the SID entry as S40? Firstly, he has purchased one quantity of the device CD-ROM on this date, and then he has purchased 10 quantities of the device CD-ROM on this date. Okay, now which is the minimum out of 1 and 10? Remember, the minimum is the smallest one, okay, and the maximum is the largest one. Since in the question they are asking us to display the minimum quantity of device, okay, so I have to take the smallest one out of 1 and 10, and this shows 1 as the value under the mean of QTY column in the output table. As a result, the last entry in the output table shows S40 for SID and 1 for mean of QTY. Now this is only the first part of the question, okay. The output or the result set that I have shown you is only for the first part of the question, okay, that displays the minimum quantity of devices purchased by each student, okay. For each of the student bearing the SID entry as S10, S20, S30 and S40, the minimum quantity of devices purchased has been calculated. Now look at the second part of the question. It says we have to display it in descending order of their ID. Now ID is represented by which column? ID is represented by this SID column. So we have to arrange this SID column in descending order. Remember that if I have to arrange in descending order, I have to arrange from big to small, okay, because in ascending order we arrange from small to big. The opposite will be in descending order. I have to arrange from big to small. So which is the biggest value for this SID column? It's S40. So S40 is going to appear first, okay. The next to come will be S30, followed by S20, and then at the end we have S10, which shows this as the result set or the output. And this is the final output after executing the first part, which involves the group by clause to be applied on the column name SID, and then the second part, which involves the order by clause to be imposed on the column SID. But since I am going to display the ID in descending order, so the use of the keyword DESC is compulsory. I have to finish this SQL statement with the DESC keyword at the end. And this is the final output or the final result set after executing this particular query. Next, I am going to show you how to use the MySQL expressions without the use of a table. MySQL also provides facilities to write and execute statement without the use of tables. And this offers a great help to perform the ad hoc calculations or retrieve the server information while programming. So what do you mean by the ad hoc calculations? Ad hoc calculations means the intermediate calculations or the temporary calculations to be performed while executing a bigger task. Now if I have to look at some MySQL expressions that does not make use of table, the example is this one. See, this SQL statement does not make use of any table. If you look at my previous SQL queries, it makes use of a table, isn't it? This particular SQL statement has made use of a table, and the table is this one, identified by the name purchase, and that is represented here. We make use of the from clause to refer to the table purchase here. Just after selecting the column names based on the condition implemented with the help of the group by clause and the order by clause. Same is the case with this SQL statement. You can see this from clause referring to this table name purchase, that is this one. But you cannot see the use of tables in this SQL expression. Now this SQL statement select 3 into 5 is going to directly compute the value of 3 into 5. Now all of you know that 3 into 5 is 15. So under the output column of 3 into 5 you can see the value 15. Then this is another example of an SQL statement that doesn't make use of any table. Okay, this statement select current underscore date is going to display the current date in the output column. So under the output column current underscore date, I can see this particular date, that is 3 June 2021. Okay, so the current date shall be represented as 3 June 2021 because this is the current date as of now. The year part is going to appear first, followed by the month part, and then the day part, all separated by a hyphen. And that's all about today's presentation, and with this I end today.